Good evening, Dungeon Masters, I'm Baron Durop. The 1993 release of Doom grabbed the horns of Wolfenstein's wild success and reshaped what the first-person shooter genre could look like. While early Doom-likes, including Duke Nukem 3D, the Quake series, and Half-Life, laid the foundations of the shooter-boomer genre and its offshoots, many of the elements which made these games popular were already established in early D&D Adventure Writing, lessons that are starting to be forgotten. So what ideas can we back-propagate from this genre into our D&D games that are being missed by contemporary D&D writers today? What might have been a solution for a lack of computing power became a mainstay staple of the Doom-like genre. Without the ability of early 90s video games to store hours of recorded dialogue or ever-flowing lore dump text, game developers had to rely on subtle environmental cues to inform players of what was going on in the world. Half-Life, for example, had winding corridors and levels which truly felt like an underground research lab, and every time the player turned a corner, they got just a bit more information about what was going on in the Black Mesa research facility. These environmental storytelling fundamentals were further refined in Half-Life 2, where right at the beginning of the game, Gordon observes Orwellian policing infrastructure that would make the CCP salivate, and occasionally spots alien assault craft scattered in the background, all building the horror of the world's narrative. Nobody in the game ever explicitly talks about the hive mind police state or the alien invasion, yet Half-Life players clearly understand Gordon's mission, and have enough context to build a solution as they play the game. The D&D takeaway here is to do as much storytelling as possible through what the players hear, see, and smell. What they observe will make the world feel more tactile and real. Rumors heard in a local tavern are fine, but players seeing what causes the rumors as they enter a village makes the information far more visceral. A possible modification to the Lost Mine of Phandelver adventure, for example, would be to change the lead-up to the Red Brand Ruffian shakedown outside the local tavern. Players should, upon entering town for the first time, observe a shopkeeper's smashed up window, boarded up businesses, and graffiti on buildings, all before the party even hears rumor about them. This gives the player an opportunity to understand what the ruffians are about before experiencing the gang's shakedown later in the main thoroughfare. In fact, if the gang were truly a problem, why isn't the town in a more dejected state already? Always think through how something would look, taste, sound, and smell because of a problem's existence and put that stuff in the adventure. Without it, the players will have nothing to be curious of and have no choice but to wait on a quest giver or NPC to lore dump at them. From BioShock's blood-smattered bathrooms to Fallout's far-too-adult teddy bears, environmental storytelling in video games had to start somewhere. For example, observe the lively worlds of Hieronymus Bosch, who revolutionized storytelling in this way. But legendary art like this can do more than enrich your campaigns, and that's where Masterworks comes in. They provided a 13.9% net return to investors just last month due to reselling a 9-figure Pierre Soulages painting users collectively invested in. Obviously, I'm not an investing guru, nor do I intend to be one. However, Masterworks clearly isn't selling digital NFTs or cryptocurrency. These are Picassos and Banksys, physical paint and canvas worth millions of dollars. In the description, you'll find links to Masterworks' SEC offering circulars, which can also be found at sec.gov. Reports by Morgan Stanley state valuable paintings can be used as a store and generator of wealth, especially since they have a near-zero correlation to other investments or the economy at large. Even during this historically tumultuous year, UBS reports that import and export of fine art is set to hit record highs. While Masterworks has historically returned a 13.9% net last month, their track record includes 7 sales just this year, with the last 3 returning over 13, 17, and 21% net. With over 600,000 users, paintings can sell out quickly, so use the link below for preloaded priority access. Thanks Masterworks for sponsoring this video. One of the most fun aspects of fighting enemies in Doom-like video games is the variety of enemies the player will encounter. Some stand back and shoot from a distance, and some rush forward for melee attacks, but whatever their behavior, each enemy offers its own problem to solve. Initially, each enemy is typically encountered by itself, so as to allow the player to get the hang of dealing with these creatures independently and learning how to exploit their weaknesses. However, the game gets exponentially more complicated when the player has to manage all of the various enemy strengths strengths and weaknesses at the same time. In BioShock, for example, the various kinds of splicers are all each their own problem and are initially encountered separately from each other, but when Jack, the protagonist, has to tango with acrobatic spider splicers, gun-toting lead heads, zippy security bots, and a Big Daddy all at the same time, combat encounters become far more complex. In D&D, we can replicate these same combat as puzzle encounters with mixed unit encounter building as well. Zombies are fine, skeletons are fine, and so are the occasional rust monster or ochre jelly lurking in a dank crypt, but putting all of these enemies in the same combat encounter will cause players to ponder how to best distribute damage without having their equipment vaporized first, especially when skeletons are shooting bows from the far end of a hallway, are being screened by zombies up in the party's face, and all while ochre jellies squeeze behind the party to eat their metal weapons and armor. Another example is to mix enemies of complementary abilities, players having to contend with a young blue dragon in the ruins of a wizard's tower in the middle of the desert, filled with desiccated flesh golems made more powerful by the dragon's breath weapon, is another great example of this. I've talked about this a few other times on my channel, but the non-linear level design of most Doom-like video games offers a lot of room for players to explore and create their own solutions. Famed game designer Janelle Jacques, who worked on projects including the Quake franchise and writer of various old-school D&D modules like the Caverns of Thracia and Dark Tower, even has a phrase coined after her that encapsulates this technique, Jacquesing the dungeon. Properly Jacques dungeons demonstrate not just that non-linear dungeon layouts should loop back on themselves, but that every loop in the dungeon's path has its own self-contained environmental storytelling that reinforces a larger narrative. Further, the levels are designed in such a way that each time a player returns to a priorly visited section of the dungeon, they typically do so from a position that was more or less unreachable, or at least now have a new context for how to deal with problems in the returned area. Halo's Combat Evolved level design for Attack on the Control Room demonstrates this concept perfectly. Master Chief must cross multiple bridges as he progresses through a wintry complex on his way to the control room, and can frequently see locations that he will visit later as he crosses the platforms, occasionally even sniping a few enemies along the way. Funnily enough, there's even one particular bridge where the Master Chief can hijack a Banshee from the enemy and fly it right to the control room's front step, bypassing a large part of the level as a reward for clever gameplay. In your own D&D dungeon design, this can be accomplished by adding causeways or raised platforms that are hard to reach from some places above and below, or are somehow encased in iron bars or other see-through barriers. While exploring a dungeon, players should return to these sequestered platforms later when approaching from other sections in the dungeon, and especially after learning something that might change the environment in some way. Rooms in distant hallways may have elevators or open-stuck portcullises in the main chamber, for example. I talk about this technique in much more detail in my Counter-Strike-inspired dungeon design video, and I'll link to it at the end of this one. An easy way to accomplish this in your dungeon design, however, is to have a central chamber with a bridge spanning the gap high above, with doors on either end of the bridge. You'd be amazed how many players will attempt to use mage hand and grappling hooks to lash together a precarious path up to a higher platform as if they were breaking the game or discovering something new, even if that was the whole point all along. In a nutshell, modern D&D level design has forgotten some of the most important aspects of the game that were absorbed by the Doom-like ecosystem, but this genre of video games can remind us of those forgotten lessons. If you'd like to help me make more content like this in the future, please consider supporting me on Patreon or becoming a channel member. Thanks for watching, Dungeon Masters, and until next time, good night.